Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Sudaso, and I'm here today with Bhante Jayasara, and we'll be answering any questions that you might have. So if you have any questions related to Buddhism that you'd like us to answer, you can type them in the comments window, and we'll answer them as they come. And when the flow of questions dries up, then we'll end the stream. So if you want us to keep talking Dhamma, then keep putting in questions. So we'll start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then we'll start going through the questions. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So hello to all the people who have checked in so far. So that's hello to Jayanta, Rick, Suzanne, A.S., Kim, Mary, Manal, Norma, Lydia, Sleep, Suzanne, Victor, Kumu, and John. Hello to all of you. It's good to see all you joining in. And we have a question here from Rick. Rick says, what guidance does the Buddha offer concerning being patient and tolerant of people who live in spiritually unskillful ways? Bhante Jay, what do you think?
Well, I think one of the main primary things to reflect on is the quote, I think it's in the Dhammapada, where the Buddha says, do not look at what others have done and not done. Look at what you have done and not done. And so that's really the most important thing. You know, how others are living in spiritually unskillful ways. That's their karma, that's their actions, that's their journey, right? You may or may not have any ability to change that. And, you know, people have to kind of learn and figure things out in their own pace. Then the most important thing really is to, if you get lost and wrapped up in, you know, getting agitated or you know, whatever because of other people's unskillful actions, the best thing to do is reflect on your own unskillful actions, especially if you are, if it comes with it a manner of like either judgment or arrogance or like looking down on them or something like that. Then especially you reflect, well, you're not so great yourself. You have, you know, these issues and you do this and you do that, kind of like balance it out. But mostly I think the most skillful thing is to bring the reflection back onto your own actions, what you've done and what you've not done, and just focus on that.
Great. And Suzanne asks, someone recently wrote that self-immolation is not suicide, but a sacrifice. It seems like suicide. What is the Buddhist view? So this might actually be coming from a particular Mahayana Sutra, and I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but there's one Mahayana Sutra where it says that a Buddhist practitioner should be willing to offer even their own body to the Buddha. The idea being that we should be willing to offer absolutely anything we have to the Buddha, even our most cherished possession, which for most people is their own body. And that developed into practice, which is relatively uncommon, but it's on rare occasions you'll encounter people who've done this, of offering a finger, usually the small finger or the small toe. And one way that that's done is actually through immolation. Through setting fire to one's own small finger or small toe. And I personally think that the statement in that sutra is metaphorical. It's not meant to be taken literally. To literally mutilate part of your body is not an offering to the Buddha. the Buddha would actually not be particularly happy about that sort of thing. He would probably be strongly opposed. And similarly, to actually immolate your entire body, that's not an offering to the Buddha. That's not something that the Buddha would be pleased by at all. So I think that's an example of a actually important statement about the willingness to one, let go of all things, including the things we're most attached to, and two, the willingness to value the Buddha above all else. So taking that the very strong wording of that sutta, which is meant to be a metaphorical teaching about a couple of very important principles of Buddhist practice. And I think some people took it too literally, to the point where they wind up doing unskillful things. So I actually personally would put self-immolation in the category of not particularly wholesome and probably quite unwholesome. There are a couple examples in Buddhist history. One of the most famous examples in recent times was during the Vietnam War. There was one monk who staged a public protest of self-immolation. And there's a particular context and reason for that. I still don't personally approve of it, but there's a particular context and reason for that. So if you study the political background of that action, then it makes a lot more sense. But it's still not a particularly Buddhist thing to do. Those are my thoughts on the matter anyway. Do you have something?
Only just to add something, especially because this has come up in sutta readings a good bunch recently. The Buddha basically addressing the sacrificing that was done, by the Brahmins and things like that, and sacrificing like 500, herds of, heads of cattle and things like that. And the Buddha pointing towards a more skillful sacrifice than killing animals. So I don't think it takes too much of a jump in logic that the Buddha, at least in the Buddha of the early texts, would not be inclined towards saying that humans should sacrifice themselves if he's trying to point us away from sacrificing animals and having a more skillful sacrifice.
Yeah, I mean, also one of the basic principles that runs throughout the Buddhist teachings is to not deliberately harm any sentient being. And so that includes yourself. So deliberately harming yourself is also directly contradictory to the Buddhist teachings. Then we have a question from John. So John says, I find that my body often stores stress responses for a long time. I find I indulge in gluttony to deal with this stress. How should I deal with this stress in a better way? Bhante, what do you think?
Yeah, well, we all have what I call habitual coping mechanisms, right? This is, the Buddha in the Salla Sutta, the simile of the arrow, talks about how when we're beset by unpleasant experience, the only escape that a patujana, an unawakened, unlearned being knows to deal with that unpleasant experience is to drown ourselves out with pleasant experience. So we do that in a lot of different ways. You talk about gluttony. I have, lots of, a lifelong worth of food issues. So I know all about these kind of things with regard to food. For other people, it's alcohol. Other people, it's drugs, sex, video games, whatever. We are trying to, kind of cover up, unpleasant experience with these, what we consider to be pleasant experiences. And so the root, right? The root is to work on and figure out and understand why the stress is arising, right? Because it's I don't even want to call it like a trauma response, but it's essentially, the gluttony, the food, for me, food is a friend, an escape, a quick hit of, of good, pleasant taste, all of these things. But what happens is that is very quick. That doesn't really actually solve your problem, right? You get drunk and you have a bender out, and then you wake up and you still have all of your suffering plus a hangover, plus more suffering, right? So the way that you deal with something like that is go to the root, right? The Milarepa, who's a Mahayana. I first heard this from Bhante Ji, actually, but I love it so much. But Milarepa, who's is it Tibetan, I think, Vajrayana, a very famous monastic, he said, when somebody throws the stick, the dog goes after the stick. I remember Bhante Ji said, the lion goes after you. So be like the lion, right? Go to the root. You have to figure out the root problem, and then the habitual coping mechanisms will not be an issue, right? You're trying to figure out some kind of escape, some kind of pleasant thing to drown out the unpleasant, but really that tends to just make things worse. So the idea is to go to the root and to work on the root cause of your stress, the anxiety, and what causes those things, and how you react to those.
Good. And Bhavani says, when mind attains the level of piti sukha, will tears start falling continuously? Well, first off, I wouldn't say the level of piti sukha, because piti and sukha are aspects of mind which they're kind of on a spectrum from 0% to 100%. And as one samadhi is developing during meditation, then that percentage of piti sukha will start rising. So you're always experiencing some degree of piti sukha as long as your samadhi is going well. And when one is entering stages of jhana, then your piti sukha will be extremely high. And will tears start falling continuously? I know I've heard of some people who they experience tears when they're in deep states of samadhi, but it doesn't seem to be particularly common. But for some people that might happen. But I wouldn't use whether or not you're getting tears falling as a basis for judging your samadhi practice. And Richard says, does Buddhism have an implied God? If not, how does the judging and managing work that is necessary to administer rebirths and their destinations? Well, Richard, I'd like to ask you a question. When you throw a ball up in the air, what happens? Falls back down, right? So who does all the judging and managing work that is necessary to administrate the falling of the ball? Is there an implied God that has to grab the ball after you throw it and throw it back down at you? No, it's just a natural law. It's just a natural unfolding of natural laws, is that when you throw a ball up, then the conditions around you throwing the ball up then create the result of the ball falling back down in a particular place in a particular way. There's no need for an implied God to come and grab the ball and throw it in a particular place, but rather the conditions surrounding your action of throwing the ball then result in the ball falling in a particular place, a particular way. So there's no need for an implied God. There's no need for judging work, managing work, or administration of any sort. So the process of karma is exactly like this. We make choices, and those choices create corresponding results. That's all. It's a natural law. Just like throwing a ball up and watching it fall back down. So there's no need for a God. There's no need for judging and managing and administration. Yep. Okay. Yeah. Good. And Robert says, how can I deal with pressure about the future, anxieties and worries? I know on some level most of these things don't actually matter, but on another I feel compelled to worry. Any ideas? What do you think?
Yeah, it's very easy to deal with the pressure of the future. You're going to die. There, pressure relieved.
This is logic.
Death is sure. Everything that happens between now and then is unsure. This is the nature of things. We don't know how it's going to turn out. So part of following the path, part of developing this practice is becoming comfortable with uncertainty. Why this is becoming comfortable and living in line with nature. Not nature like the trees, but living in line with the Dhamma, the nature of reality. The nature of reality is what? Anicca, impermanence, instability, undependability. There's nothing that's permanent. There's nothing that's stable. There's nothing that you can depend on. It all eventually changes, moves, falls apart. And so as you develop your practice and you start to see that in your experience, your wisdom and insight develop, and you just naturally live in accordance with the Dhamma. You just naturally live and understand that this is the nature of things. I don't know where I'll be in 2 days. I don't know if I'll be alive in 2 days. We don't know. So you can, when you understand this, there's two choices. You kind of just get stay mired in anxiety and I don't know what's going to happen in the next 2 seconds. Or do you say, well, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm just going to live the best life I can and do the best, right? And the simile of the mountains coming in, Pabbatoppama Sutta, the Buddha tells us that old age, sickness, and death are coming in like mountains as high as the sky, crushing everything in their wake. And he asked the great king, he says, well, what do you do in this situation? And the great king says, what can you do but practice Dhamma and do good deeds? So anytime you're kind of, wrapped up in that fear and that anxiety, I don't know what's going to do. Well, the great king gave the answer 2,600 years ago. Practice Dhamma, do good deeds. That's the basis. Everything else that comes from that, that's okay one way or the other. But practicing Dhamma, living in line with the Dhamma, doing good deeds, that's always something you can fall back on. And if then you focus on that, and then whatever comes.
Good. And Norma asks, what is the best advice for having aversion to unsettling information? I can't shake a negative feeling. I can't necessarily promise the best advice, but one advice I would give is stop trying to get rid of the negative feeling and start by paying attention to that feeling. So just observing whatever feeling is arising in the mind and observing it as a natural phenomenon. So it's natural. When you receive unsettling information, it's natural to have a negative feeling in the mind. So observe that feeling, observe it as a natural result of an experience, and recognize that it's not personal. It's just like if you eat some spoiled food, then you get a stomachache. It's not personal. That's just the natural result. If you're out in the cold, then you start shivering. Well, it's just natural. It's not personal. It's just a natural result. Well, the mind actually works the same way. The mind produces sensations, and those sensations are produced in response to stimuli. It's exactly the same as the body. The difference is that when things are mental or emotional, we tend to take them personally. And this is a huge mistake. So instead, recognize it's natural. It's natural to have an unpleasant feeling in the mind when you receive unpleasant information. Just as it's natural to have an unpleasant sensation in the body if you step on a sharp object or eat something bitter or unpleasant tasting, or you're out in the cold or something. Well, it's natural. So start with just paying attention to and accepting that sensation as natural and as impersonal. And from that, you'll already start to experience some equanimity just from that perspective change. You can also reflect on the fact that you actually can't do anything about most of the information that you receive. This is especially the case with people who get really upset about world news. They're like, oh, there's a war going on in this country, a war going on in that country, bad things happening here, bad things happening there. And it's like, yeah, What are you going to do about it? Nothing. That's what. You think you can go to Middle East and like create peace in the Middle East all by yourself tomorrow? I don't think so. You think you can go and solve all the ecological disasters in such and such a place all by yourself tomorrow? I don't think so. So what's the point in getting upset about these things? You literally can't do anything about 99% of the unpleasant information you receive. And the other 1%, well, then you better do something. If you actually can do something, then do something. If you can't do something, then you don't have anything to worry about. So when you reflect in this way, then you realize that actually there's really nothing to be bothered by in the first place. It's just samsara displaying its nature. And the nature of samsara is to be a disaster zone. It always has been and it always will be. And once we accept that, then we start looking for what realistic ways we can help. And we delight in the realistic ways we can help. And we're not bothered by all the things we can't do anything about, which is almost everything.
I remember I used to have this thing at my desk at work, and part of it was like, there's a problem. And it's like, can you do anything about it? This is, yes? Okay, good. No problem. No? Okay, good. No problem.
That's a good flow chart.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, John has another question. This looks very similar to the previous one. You might have already answered this, but maybe you have something more to add. So John says, I find my mind often relies on things as a crutch, for example, sugary foods, the news, etc. Okay, I get the sugary food thing, but news? Sugary food is at least pleasant. News is rarely pleasant. What is a good way to make the mind stronger and remove the crutch?
I mean, unless you like, I remember when I watched the news when I was younger, at least the local news, like if you just showed up for the last 5 minutes, then you'd get something positive.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So the first 55 minutes are negative.
Yes, like wars, death, rape, everything. And then it's like, oh, look at this cute puppy, or this person saved this. You get like just a little bit of niceness at the end.
And on a good note.
Yeah. But yeah, this is, I think I pretty much did cover this. These are our coping mechanisms. This is what we do to try to make the mind stronger and remove the crutch. You have to work with that. You have to practice. You have to kind of develop and have a patient endurance to, have this mindfulness and be like, you know what? Okay, I feel this unpleasant experience and I really want to go whatever, get that sugary food or this, and I'm just going to try to be with it. And when you first start doing that, it's like 2/4 of half a second and you lose and you just go and do it. And that's okay. But if you were able to hold out for that half a second, that's a victory. And then it just builds and builds. And if you're able to stay with that unpleasant experience of, I feel like I need to do this. I feel like I need to do this. If you're able to stay with that, you can learn a lot from it. That's how you develop wisdom and insight. This is why Buddha says patient endurance is the best practice. This patient endurance allows us to stick with something to see how it is, and we can learn from that.
Great. And AS says, the second precept to undertake training rule to abstain from taking what is not given. Is this just actual things, or can we consider others' time or generosity too, not to take advantage of others? Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. Also not to be greedy or demanding with others in any respect, not only with physical objects, but also with time, as you mentioned, time, attention, emotional capacity, and so on. We should always try to be considerate and respectful of others and not take more than what they're actually ready to give.
Bhante is back. Yay.
That is true. Yep. And PL says, is Vibhava Tanha have a more subtle meaning, a form of subtle craving at the end of the path to stop becoming, which can also cause restlessness, that is also one of the higher fetters? I often wonder why Patujanas ask about the end of the path, when realistically they need to be focusing more on the beginning of the path. So I don't know, maybe Pial, maybe you are a non-returner who's just finally working out the last few details before becoming an arhat, maybe. In which case, why are you asking these questions to us? If you're actually to that stage, then you don't actually really need to ask questions to anyone. So odds are you're much closer to the beginning of the path, in which case asking about the subtle persisting remnants of self-attachment that persist in somebody in the short period of time before they become an arhat. These questions are not really relevant or useful. Those questions are not really relevant or useful to about 99.99999% of Buddhist practitioners. Virtually every single Buddhist practitioner should instead be asking, how can I become a stream enterer? How can I become a sotapanna, the first stage of awakening? That's really the only important question to ask. It's actually only ever the important question to ask, because once you're a sotapanna, you don't need instruction anymore, because you can figure out the rest on your own. So the only question is, how can I become a stream enterer? That's it. So vibhava tanha then, as a problem for someone trying to become a stream enterer, it's usually something a bit more coarse. It's sometimes described as the desire for non-existence, but that's only one specific example of vibhava tanha. Vibhava tanha actually more generally means the desire to avoid states of being. So the generalized wish to not exist at all is actually the most extreme form of vibhava tanha. Normally it takes more the form of, I don't like this state of being and I want it to stop. So for example, maybe you're having a particular strong emotion and you're like, I just don't want to deal with this. That's vibhava tanha. Or you're with a group of people that you just can't stand and you're like, I want to be anywhere except with this group of people. That's vibhava tanha. So you mentioned a form of subtle craving to stop becoming. I mean, that is an aspect of vibhava tanha, but that's not what the average person is dealing with. I mean, sometimes what can happen as someone's understanding of Dhamma increases is sometimes there can be this depression, realizing they're stuck in samsara, and samsara is this like awful disaster zone, and it's like, oh, I really hate this. I want it to just come to an end. That is also vibhava tanha, and it is in fact an obstacle to awakening, ironically enough. So instead, what we want is a calm and peaceful disenchantment with samsara, rather than a hostility or disgust with existence. Okay. And Kristen asks, what do venerables admire about each other? Well, about Bhante J, I admire his, how genuine he is, actually. He's very genuine, very honest, very transparent. Yeah, also very caring. Yeah, he's a lovely fellow.
Yeah. Bhante, one of the most things I admire about Bhante is that he can kind of come across as like stern, and he'll talk about how he is an aversive type of things like that, but he has a really huge heart. That he's a very kind, big-hearted person, and sometimes you have to get through the initial things to see that. But yeah, I've known Bhante. It's almost been
10 years.
9 years, almost 10 years. Yeah, and especially in the beginning, he is very kind to me, very including me in things, and also part of the aversiveness that I do love is that is why I can actually pronounce Pali pretty good, because he would be like, no, it's this way. You're saying it wrong. So yeah, I've had much gratitude towards Bhante all these years, and that's why one of the main reasons I still come around. So
it's odd. I'm happy you still come around.
Yeah.
And John says, have you ever dealt with disharmony in your community? If so, how did you deal with it to restore harmony? How do you balance communal respect and differences in views? So the truth is, pretty much any time you get more than one person together for any length of time, then sooner or later there's disharmony. That's more or less inevitable. So literally every single monastic community I've ever lived in has had disharmony problems sooner or later. And the longer a community exists, the more likely it is that there's going to be disharmony. And eventually there's going to be something large scale that happens, some kind of major disagreement or major conflict. That's all quite normal. How do you deal with it? The main way you deal with these things is through, first off, through conversation, talking with each other, trying to figure out what's going on, and also learning how to relate to each other as fellow unenlightened humans who are trying to practice the Buddhist path. So usually when there's disharmony, we tend to start demonizing the other people. Like our mind generates a story about how the other person is such a nasty, foolish, stupid brute. And but then you actually start talking to them and listening to them and paying attention to their experience, and you start to realize, actually, they're not so different from me. They're just another unenlightened person who's trying to practice Buddhism. And then you can start to connect with each other on those shared values, those shared commitment to Buddha Dhamma. And sometimes actually what you eventually come to is the conclusion that you're better off living in different communities. But if so, then you can come to that conclusion in a peaceful way that's mutually respectful. And sometimes you can find a way to continue living together in a way that supports each other's practice without causing too much difficulty. But either way, you can reach that point through, again, the shared commitment, shared recognition of the shared commitment to Buddhist principles, and by genuinely listening to each other, really trying to understand each other's perspectives and experiences. Anything you want to add?
You pretty much covered what I was going to say, so it worked out. Yeah.
And John, I'm actually not trying to give you all the John questions. It's just okay. How they're coming in. John says, how should I practice sense restraint when my mind reacts very quickly, positively and negatively, to certain objects? It seems my mind isn't getting caught up in features. It seems to be a habit. What do you think? So
this is why really developing satipatthana, mindfulness, foundations of mindfulness, things happen quick. And what happens is we have automatic responses. We just respond. We're not thinking. Stimulus, response. Mindfulness allows us to have options, right? To give us that pause. As we go, okay, here, the stimulus, and this is what I normally do. And that's kind of unskillful because it causes me suffering and then I harm other people and all these things. And you have these reflections, and then because you've watched yourself do it over and over again. And then, so then you're able to kind of put a wedge between that stimulus and that response and say, no, I'm going to do something better. I'm going to act more skillfully. But that is something that develops over time. You have to really, honestly, John, I think the main answer to all your questions is develop satipatthana. Develop a very strong mindfulness practice, investigating everything. Whatever is arising, you can investigate it. You can learn from it. You can understand it. So the answer is going to be develop foundations of mindfulness and then apply what you learn and how you develop it to understanding what's arising and the different responses that you have towards what's arising.
Good. And Rick says, can you share some reflections on how to overcome self-doubt? Yes, reflect upon your own progress on the path. Generally speaking, anyone who has been practicing Buddhism for longer than a few weeks can recognize that there's been some improvement. And if you've been practicing for a few years, then you should be able to recognize substantial improvement. So reflect on your progress on the path. Remind yourself of your own goodness. Remind yourself of your own development. And you'll realize, oh, actually, I can do this. It's slow, it's challenging, but I can do it. Another thing I find really useful is to remember that throughout the hundreds of past lives in which the Buddha was practicing to develop the conditions to eventually attain awakening. So throughout all those hundreds and hundreds of lives, actually hundreds isn't even beginning to touch the number, but that's beside the point. So through all those many, many past lives, at some point, the Buddha went through exactly the same set of conditions that you are going through now. And he turned out perfectly fine in the end. So at some point, he was literally identical to you. Same exact problems, same exact defilements, same exact confusion, exactly the same. And through practicing as best he could, he was able to overcome those difficulties. So that means you also can. You also are on the same, you're following in the footsteps of the Buddha. You're going in the same direction. It's just a matter of persistence, of sticking with it. And Sleep Doc says, from a Buddhist perspective, is having faith in a universal life force, aka God, another form of Maya?
I think you have a better understanding of what Maya is, so you might have a better chance of answering this.
Well, we don't actually use the word Maya in that way in Buddhism. So in Hinduism, you sometimes encounter the word Maya in its meaning of illusion, of the idea that our experience of reality is illusory. We don't use the word quite that way in Buddhism. So that would be the first issue here. The second is, as for universal life force, well, it all depends what you mean by that. So there are ways of defining universal life force or God, if you want to use the word God. There's ways of defining it which are not in conflict with Buddhism. And there's ways of defining it which are in conflict with Buddhism. So it all depends on how you define it. Briefly speaking, the main issue which you might run into is that from the Buddhist viewpoint, everything is impermanent, everything is unsatisfying, and everything is impersonal, has no lasting self-essence. So if you're defining universal life force in a way that is permanent, pleasant, and personal, then that's going to be a problem. But if you're defining it in a way that is impermanent, unsatisfying, and impersonal, then there's no problem. So Mary says, I have been tested by impermanence lately. A beloved animal that I cared for 5 years is lost, missing, dead. I can't seem to let it go. Are there ways to accept these aspects of life? Grief sucks. What do you think?
Grief is a very important teacher. Right? Grief is the kind of natural process that brings us through the ability to accept that this being is not not around us anymore. This attachment has been broken. That's really what grief is. Grief is really like grieving, working through the process of an attachment that has been broken. So grief, yes, of course it sucks, right? Because why? Because we have an attachment. And as the Buddha says, if you have even one dear one, you have one suffering. Right? Because we have attachment, we will have suffering. That doesn't mean that, unless you want to become a monastic, doesn't mean just, say, I'm not attached to anybody, screw you, mother and father, and all these. That's not what this means. It's understanding that I have attachments, and naturally, this means that when there is loss, I will suffer because of those attachments. So this is perfectly normal. It's absolutely perfectly normal. It's perfectly natural. And you can learn from it. Let yourself go through the grieving process. No repression, no suppression. Be with the suckiness. right? Learn from it, investigate it, understand it, and know what it means to have an attachment that has turned into a loss. Right? That's what I would suggest. Usually you can't seem to let it go, and this is also sounds like it's fairly recent, right? So, after a loss, there might be weeks or months even where your mind is really unable to do much else but process the grief. Right? So it's early, and this is a very prominent experience that's happening to you right now. So this is what you're dealing with, and you're going through this process, but eventually it will get better as you go through the grieving process and come to an acceptance and all that, after you go through the anger and the bargaining and all these other kind of things. But it takes time. So yes, this is normal, natural part of life, part of having attachments. And you understand that it's not something like, random and unheard of in existence. It's not like, we kind of feel when we're going through situations like that, this is like, nobody else has gone through this. This is the only, no, like everybody will go through it multiple times in their lifetime. And all of our ancestors going back, a million years of humanity has gone through this. So these are very normal aspects of life. And once you understand that, when in the future, when it arises again, you understand, okay, this is to be expected. I don't need to fall apart. I know what to do. I've done it before. I'll just go through the process, learn what I can from the process in my growth and on my path.
Okay, thank you. And Minnie asks, is it okay to get burps during meditation? I get burps a lot when I meditate, especially during Vipassana or in mindfulness on impermanence. Well, first off, I would say don't be so bothered by what happens with the body. Just observe the body sensations and accept that the body is doing what bodies do. And one of the aspects of the body is that there is air inside the body, and that air can move around inside the body and create interesting sensations. So just be aware that that's part of the experience of the body. And actually, if you're doing mindfulness of impermanence, then that's perfect, because it's something that's constantly changing. Second, another interesting thing to pay attention to is, are you actually getting these sensations more frequently during meditation, or is it just that you're more aware of it? For example, when we're going through our day normally, you might not notice the sound of the clock ticking, but then you sit down to meditate, and after a couple of minutes, you're like, God, that clock is really loud. The ticking of that clock is really loud, but it's been there all along. You just didn't notice until you started developing mindfulness in such an intensive way. So start paying attention to your body all day long, and you might notice that there's air movements going on in the body all the time. You just don't normally register it. And also sometimes it is caused by what we're doing during meditation. One thing which can trigger air movement in the body is shifting your posture a lot. So like if you're prone to like slumping and straightening up and slumping and straightening up a lot, then that kind of massaging of your body can cause air movements. Sometimes also people start breathing in kind of unnatural or forced ways during meditation, and that can also cause unpleasant or unusual body sensations. So also make sure your breath is just flowing naturally and smoothly. That will also tend to stop these things. But again, generally speaking, if you're sitting with good posture and you're not moving around a lot, then you shouldn't be experiencing more air bubbles than usual. And if you are, well, then just observe the sensations with equanimity, because it's just the nature of the body. It's actually listed when the Buddha is talking about mindfulness of the body. He sometimes includes air movements in the body, upgoing wind, downgoing wind, winds coursing through the stomach, winds coursing through the body. He sometimes mentions that as an aspect of mindfulness of the body.
Missed one.
Did I?
Another.
Okay. Oh, John says, how can I become a stream enterer? Bante J.
Follow the Noble Eightfold Path.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Good
No,
answer.
that is literally how you become a stream enterer. There's no other special techniques or teachings. It's literally you follow the Noble Eightfold Path.
Yeah. And Norma says, what is the main ingredient in understanding stream entry? Yeah, it's following the Eightfold Path. The really critical bit is actually, if you read the Kosambhya Sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya, that gives one of the most detailed descriptions of stream entry that you'll find anywhere in the suttas. So Kosambhya Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya, about 1/3 of the way through. I forget the number. Minnie asks, how to overcome self-view?
Follow the Noble Eightfold Path.
And practice generosity, practice kindness, and cultivate the perception of impermanence, and follow the Eightfold Path. Yeah.
That's pretty much the answer for everything. I mean, it is the fourth noble truth.
Mm. And Joseph says, could you kindly extol the superiority of the bliss of peace and cessation of desires in comparison to the gratification of sensual pleasures? That sounds less like a question and more like a statement. Would you like to say something on this?
Or the request for an essay. This is so the superiority of basically what I'm getting from this is like compare the superiority of like the bliss of like samadhi jhanas, like that bliss not of the sensual desires compared to sensual desires, right? The Buddha talks about how this kind of real bliss and pleasure that you find in things like the jhanas is not to be afraid of, right? These are because these are not of the gross craving and desire for sensual pleasures. So this is the difference, right? It could be also that this kind of the bliss and the pleasure that arises from being in these deep states is much more subtle. Right? There is a kind of pleasure in being free of the kind of gross craving and desire and chasing after sensual pleasures. That Chaito Vimutti, the mind freed from these things, is a very pleasant mind. Right? It's a mind that's not in the rat race. People say when they use the word the rat race, they think, oh, that means 9 to 5 for 50 years. But the real rat race, this is the samsaric rat race, the rat race of chasing after pleasant things and running away from unpleasant things. And when you're able to, whether it's in jhanas or samadhi or through very, very strong mindfulness or whatever, when you're able to kind of at least temporarily break yourself away from that, it's very peaceful, very content. It's way better than whatever food or sex or whatever, or any of these things, because that the kind of underlying anxiety, that underlying pressure is not there. It's a bliss that comes from letting go, from abandoning, as opposed to chasing and acquiring.
And Rick says, what are skillful means when interacting with family members who insist on controlling us, even being a bully to get their way? Stop talking to them. That makes a huge difference. In all honesty, if somebody is really just being a bully and trying to control you all the time in unwholesome ways, just don't interact with them. Reduce your contact with them. And if they ask you why, then you can actually tell them exactly why. You can tell them because whenever there's interactions, the interactions are unwholesome. And you'd rather have a more pleasant relationship with them. But yeah, just stop interacting with them. That's actually the most clean, direct, and simple way of dealing with this. Yeah, non-confrontational. If the person is sharp, they'll get the hint pretty clearly. If they're not, well, either way, at least you don't have to deal with their problems. Usually it's when people are doing these sorts of things, it's nothing to do with you. It's just their own suffering. They're manifesting their own suffering in these inappropriate behavior patterns. The other thing you can do is to look and see what the underlying motive is. Sometimes what looks like somebody else trying to control us is because they actually care about us and they're trying to help us. But they're trying to help us in a way which we don't perceive as helpful. They're trying to help us in a way that we perceive as invasive or harsh or rude. So if that's the case, then try to look for the underlying compassion or kindness and express your appreciation for that. You can say things like, oh, I really appreciate how you're trying to help me. I really appreciate what you're trying to do. And when the time is right, then you can also tell them, I appreciate what you're trying to do. And right now I feel the need to do things in a different way. But thank you so much for what you're doing. I do appreciate the kindness. So trying to focus on their underlying goodness and your appreciation for their underlying goodness, but while also keeping to your own sense of what's right, your own sense of what's appropriate. And also sometimes you just consider, like, is this actually worth fighting? Maybe not. Maybe I should just go with what they want after all. Maybe it really isn't such a big deal. Because sometimes it really isn't a big deal. And sometimes we're the ones who are making a problem out of the situation. So it's also to ask yourself, is this actually a big deal? Or am I just making it into a big deal? So Rick says, I have become disenchanted with the greed and materialism of how Christmas is celebrated in the USA. What are skillful ways to interact with non-Buddhists during the holidays? Do you want to talk about this?
Sure. Yeah. Well, this is the season of giving, right? You know, this is the season of dana, generosity, kindness. Act in those ways. Doesn't matter what, you know, the materialism of Christmas or things like that. This is, you know, somebody who grew up with Christmas. That was never really part of my Christmas. It was never, you know, Christmas for me was family, generosity, goodness, and kindness. And people, you know, at least once a year actually like kind of being kind to each other and saying hello and, you know, Merry Christmas or whatever, like, which is, you know, a pretty rare thing. Now, of course, I think that's kind of dead now in society. I don't even know if that, how much that exists, but that's kind of like what I remember. And I think, you know, in anything that has become a kind of large thing, there's always going to be a corruptedness about it, right? The Catholic Church, there's corruption. The Buddhist, you know, many Buddhist high places in Buddhist countries, there's corruption. Things become corrupted, right? When they become very big and kind of very old, and it's just the nature of things falling apart. So focus on what's important. Focus on that kindness and goodness and generosity and you know, saying hi to people. Most people don't even do that anymore, right? Holding doors for people, all these kind of just basic societal kindnesses that people used to do. I'm not even that old, and I remember these things, you know, but it's kind of different now. Everybody's kind of become a bit narcissistic, wrapped up in their own world and not really kind of out and open to bringing that kindness and goodness to other people. So that's what I would say. Focus on the good parts.
And Minnie asks, is it necessary to do mindfulness of breathing, or can one do metta meditation or mindfulness of body instead to attain one-pointedness? I get one-pointed with metta faster. Do whatever works, and whatever works for you. So if you get good results with metta, then do metta. If you get good results with mindfulness of the body, then do that. If you get good results with mindfulness of breathing, then do that. So you're not obligated to only meditate in one way. Rather, meditation is an exploration, an investigation to see what is helpful for you, and to figure out how to work with your mind. And that can also change over time. So something which works well for you now, you might need to do something different next year, or tomorrow, for that matter. So also being flexible and adaptable with observing the shifting conditions and needs of your own mind. But yeah, do whatever works for you. You're not obligated to do mindfulness of breathing if it's not the best choice for you. And John, seems you're getting all the John questions. John says, why do you think society has become unkind and narcissistic? And how should I do my part to help others?
How many hours do we have? I have a lot of things to say about that, but I think that we're in a very novel time, like with social media and all kinds of things that we're Stone Age, descendants of apes trying to figure out how to live in a time where we're becoming cyborgs and things like this, I think we don't know how to be human with a lot, like social media, like the cell phones and everybody taking selfies and all these kind of things, and this kind of just focus on self, and also the kind of way we're raising children that leads towards this way. It's just not really good for society, but it's not like this is a special time in people. Societies go through cycles. The Buddha even talks about this, right? Like there's this grand cycle of how people essentially become more immoral and they live in lesser years, right? And then they realize, well, maybe we should be more moral. And then they start being more moral and they follow the precepts, and then the years grow longer and things like that. It's just the cycles of like growth and decay. And I think, especially in America, I think we're kind of in, if you wanted to go with, like history, we're kind of in like late Roman Republic about to fall into an empire kind of era. We're just like in this wacky time where things are falling apart. So again, it goes down to, well, what can I do? Well, you can try to be as kind as you can, try to be a role model of something different. That's one of the reasons I became a monastic, right? Because being a monastic is a role model of something different. Now, when I first became a Buddhist, that's what I really looked for. Because these were people who were doing something different than the society around them. And that hasn't changed. That's how it was in the Buddhist time. That's how it is now. So try to be something different, something better than the rest of society. And you're not going to change like Bhante was talking about, like, these natural cycles of history. You can't just, you're not going to change anything. This is just what's going to happen around you. If you look at through history, people who lived through civil wars and all kinds of rapid changing in history, some individuals may have had some ability to do to change but most of us don't. So we can only figure out what can we do, and it's not going to help the world, but it'll at least maybe be of benefit to some people around us.
Okay. And Joseph says, how should one practice to make their mind in tune with the elements, specifically in regards to overcoming horror, humiliation, and disgust? So if you're having problems with horror, humiliation, and disgust, well, the question is in relationship to what? But also it sounds to me like there's some kind of resistance towards the nature of reality. So reality just is what it is. There's actually nothing inherently disgusting about reality. It's just natural. So it's the nature of bodies to grow, to age, to decay, to die, to rot, to decompose, to turn back into dirt. That's just the nature of bodies. It's also the nature of bodies to consume food and excrete feces, to consume liquids and excrete urine. There's nothing disgusting about that. It's just the nature of reality. It's just how nature operates. It's just all the components of nature just shifting places and moving around. Like there's nothing disgusting there. It's just the unfolding of cause and effect. So this kind of way of observing tends to lead to a natural, cool equanimity without this problem of horror, humiliation, and disgust. So M says, I am terrorized by the question of whether there is a God. What was before the Big Bang? Let's assume another universe. We can play that into infinity. But somewhere there must have been a beginning, even if everything is just an illusion or a matrix. There must have been the first unmoving mover. What can you give me as an Orthodox Buddhist answer to this? Or why is there anything and not nothing?
M is having an existential crisis.
Oh.
That's pretty much what it looks like. Yeah, I mean, in terms of Buddhism, the Buddha tried to find a beginning and he couldn't. And so he says there is no beginning, no seen beginning to this mass of suffering. So if you wanted to think of it as just the cycles going around and around and around, essentially forever, you could think about it in that way. But the Buddha talks about, especially in one specific sutta, there's 4 imponderables. And so the Buddha talks about these concepts where if you try to intellectually ponder them, your head would explode. You'd get nowhere. It's not really going to help you on the path. It's not really going to help you get anywhere. And these kind of questions are one of the things like this. How can you know? You can't travel. Even if a fully awakened Sama Buddha couldn't find the answer, are you going to? No, you're not going to. So this is the Buddhist perspective. The Buddhist perspective is that their things go in cycles. There's no kind of beginning to all of this scene, right? There's no one of the things, because of one line in the suttas, people think the line about the mind is is clear but has defilements. People might say that means that there was a clear mind sometime in the past. Oh, I highly doubt it. I mean, the Buddha couldn't find this clear mind sometime in the past. So, as you develop along the path and the Buddha is calling things correctly so much, eventually you give the benefit of the doubt. And eventually you just why am I just wrap my mind off this? It's actually not conducive to the path. It's not conducive to the lessening of my suffering. In fact, it's creating more suffering. So why am I bothering with it? Why don't I just let it go and focus on here, now, I'm in the present. Am I in a simulation? Am I not in a, who knows? Who cares? I'm here. I practice. That's what I know, right? Then you don't have to worry about having existential crises all the time and you know, being frozen.
Good. Okay, and so Benjamin says, I'm an Anagarika in the Ajahn Chah tradition. I'm unimpressed and uninspired by the senior monks. The Vinaya seems loose. I focus on my own practice, but wonder if I'm wasting my time here. Advice? Well, first off, something that I would encourage you to remember is that most monks are not enlightened, and that also includes most senior monks. Most senior monks are also not enlightened. Sometimes, yeah, they're not particularly impressive. Sometimes they're not particularly inspiring. That's true. Look to see if there is anything impressive or anything inspiring about them. Is there anything in their conduct or their behavior that you do find impressive or inspiring? Anything in their knowledge of Dhamma that you find inspiring? Anything in their, anything at all that you can look at and say, okay, that is impressive, that is inspiring. And if the answer is no, then sometimes it's good to ask questions such as, how have you changed over your years of practice? One thing I found very interesting, many years ago, I met a senior monk, not from the Ajahn Chah tradition, but actually from a different lineage. And I met the senior monk and I was very unimpressed. I was seriously like, has this guy just been wasting the last 20 years of his life? What's going on? And then I started picking up some stories about what this guy was like before he became a monk. And I realized, oh, he's made incredible progress. Right now, he's very unimpressive. 20 years ago, he was 100 times worse. So that's something else to keep in mind. Maybe right now they're not very impressive, but they were probably a lot worse. And that's what we're not seeing. We're not always seeing the progress that somebody's made. As for Vinaya seeming loose, I mean, I don't know what Ajahn Chah monks you're talking about, but normally Ajahn Chah monks are, in terms of the overall scale of the Buddhist world, they're in the top 5% of Vinaya practice. Not perfect by any means, but much better than the vast majority of Buddhist monks in the world. Most of them. Of course, you find some exceptions, but generally speaking, the Vinaya standards are much higher than average. That said, it's also important to remember what the Vinaya actually is. The Vinaya is a support to our Dhamma practice. The Vinaya is not an ends to itself. The definition of a good Buddhist monk is not somebody who follows the Vinaya perfectly. The definition of a good Buddhist monk is someone who is cultivating wholesome mind states. And if we're using Vinaya in a way that's supporting the development of Dhamma practice, that's supporting wholesome mind states, then that's good. If we're using Vinaya in a way which is weakening or diminishing our wholesome mind states, then even if we're keeping Vinaya strictly, that's actually bad. That's not good at all. It means that somewhere along the way, we've misapprehended the Vinaya. We've grasped it in the wrong way. So the Vinaya is meant to be a tool that supports our Dhamma practice. It's not necessarily about how tight or loose you hold the Vinaya. It's about, can you use Vinaya in a way that supports your Dhamma practice? That's the important question. As for focusing on your own practice, that's the right option. As always, that's always the right choice, focusing on your own practice. And you wonder if you're wasting your time there. Well, that's ultimately, you need to ask yourself whether you're wasting your time there. Are you making progress or not? It's also good to remember, by the way, that wherever you begin your training, that's not necessarily where you're going to be for the rest of your life. You're probably going to be there for a few years, maybe not even that, but you're probably going to be there for a few years. But then after your first few years of monastic life, you can go where you wish and do what you wish. So sometimes the question is not, is this the ideal place for me to spend the rest of my life? But rather, is this a suitable place to receive the first few years of training? And if the answer is yes, then it might be worth staying. But these are all questions that you need to ask yourself. It's not something that I can give an answer to in this format. But you need to ask yourself these questions. Anything you wanted to add to that?
I would not have. I would never have made a bet that an Anagarika and an Ajahn Chah monastery would be watching a live stream and asking us a question. That's quite a surprise. But I think Bhante covered most of it very well. I have had the opportunity to be around lots and lots of monks, including some very, very famous monks. And the longer you're with them, the more you see the humanity. Like we kind of have this view that monks are even like, this is very common among lay people, like, oh, one of the lines that I came up with is, you don't become perfect, then become a monastic. You become a monastic to become perfect. Right. So if you think like, everybody's like, oh, I'm half awakened already, now I'm going to become a monastic. You think monastic? No. Right. There's greed, hatred, and delusion in all of us who are unawakened. And as Bhante say, the overwhelming majority of monastics are not awakened. We're all trying to, in our own way, in our own practice, at least trying to get there. Most of us, at least, are sincerely trying to. So it is very important to focus on, well, what can I learn from this monastic, both in what I should do and also what I know now that I see I'll never want to do this, right? So you can learn from senior monastics, both skillful and unskillful actions. You can say, I want to make sure that I don't do this. And that's good. That's just as much learning as from something very skillful and very wise. And people have this kind of view that like, I have to make, if I'm around very wise, awakened monastics, then that will just make things easier for me. And then I'll become, no, you, especially as a monastic, it's really up to you, as Bhante said, right? Do you read the Vinaya? Do you know it very well? You're reading it constantly, like a little bit every day, knowing, because my experience is that most Buddhist monks have actually never read the Vinaya. There's commentaries, there's little books, there's what the teacher says, but they actually don't read what the Vinaya is. And I've had the experience of, as a junior monk, knowing things that people who were, ordained decades more than me didn't know. And it was a really eye-opening thing for me. And that's because it's something actually I enjoy. I really like to read the Vinaya, and I read through it multiple times even before I was a monk, because I knew I wanted to be a monk. So if you really know the Vinaya, and as you're living the monastic life, lay people have certain perceptions of things. And they'll take something that is really a minor rule and think like a monk just killed their mother, right? and then they might not realize that this is a very serious thing, and they might just think, oh, it's no problem, right? Because they haven't, not only do they not know the Vinaya, but they haven't lived it. This is the thing. I went through this. It's like, okay, I learned it a lot before I became a monk, but once I started to have to live the rules and understand a lot of the nuances, that changed things. But I know that I'm not reliant on a senior monastic to tell me how to live by the Vinaya. I know it. I've studied it. And I've also had now 7 years of living it. So I can experience it. So I think that's very important as somebody who wants to become a monastic, is to take the initiative to know the rules you're supposed to be living under. Don't just say, oh, the teacher will tell me all the rules that I need to know. You know them. And then, yeah, there's monks that are doing bad things, monks that are doing good things. It doesn't matter. I'll learn from them what I can, and I have my own path, my own practice, and that's what I'm going to focus on.
Okay. And Rick says, In 2007, I knew that it was important to live a celibate life and focus on spiritual practice. I was at peace for over 15 years. However, last year, I made a determination to live a celibate life as part of practicing the 8 precepts. After making this determination, the mind has become fixated on images and feelings of sexual desire and wanting a spouse again. Can you share some reflections on this experience? Yeah, it's perfectly natural. Yeah, of course. You made a determination and now your mind is rebelling. You're starting to discover that actually you still have desires. And those desires are coming up in the mind. So it's actually quite common to have that kind of experience. And so now your challenge is to learn how to work with it. So part of the value of taking precepts is that it makes us look more closely at our impulses and urges in the mind and learn how to deal with those impulses and urges in an appropriate way. Yeah, so this is part of the practice. If you want to take on the practice of celibacy, then you need to learn how to deal with feelings of sexual desire. And that will teach you much about the nature of the mind. There's a reason why celibacy has always been a central principle in Buddhist monasticism. It's a very powerful way of training the mind. It's not always easy. It's not always comfortable. In fact, it's quite often challenging and unpleasant. But as you work with the practice of celibacy, then you'll notice that you come to a deeper understanding of your own mind and stronger control of your own mind. Yeah, it's not a quick and easy process. It takes time.
And sexual desire and wanting a spouse again are 2 different motivations.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's the like you can even, as a monk, you might not necessarily feel like, oh, I want to go out and have sex, but you might feel, oh, it'd be nice if I had a partner or something. Like you might have like thoughts arise. They're connected at some level, but there are also different motivations at another. So you watch that as well.
And Anjan says, if I live only in the present moment all the time, then I cannot even plan for my day. What am I missing here? What is he missing here?
Yeah, well, first of all, nobody can actually live in the present moment all the time. Maybe only awakened beings. But when it comes to things like planning, we have to plan. You have to plan things out, especially if you have kids, you have to plan, retirement and savings and college and all that. You have to make plans. Making plans is actually not a bad or evil thing. What happens is that we attach to those plans, and when things change, we don't want to change the plans, or we suffer, we have expectations. If you understand anicca, you understand, well, these are the best plans I can make now. You kind of have to plan. Maybe even you plan to wake up in the morning, or else you could just sit there being a veg. But you have to understand that plans are impermanent as well. Right? What you think you're going to do is impermanent, because you might have plans and then life has other plans. So your ability to adapt and adjust is that ability of being in the present moment. If you're mindful, then you realize this plan isn't working out. I need to do something else. So I think that's what I can say about that.
Good. And Joseph says, Venerable Ananda said the reason Venerable Sariputta was unable to feel grief for the death of even the Buddha himself because he had abandoned conceit. What is the relation between grief and conceit? Well, the word conceit, this is normally the translation for the Pali word mana. And mana more precisely means concept. And specifically, it's the concept of self-identity, the concept of self-existence, the concept of me, self-concept. So as long as there's a self-concept, I am this is mine, this is who I am, then there's the opportunity for grief. I have lost what was mine. But when there is no self-concept, then it's impossible to think I have lost what was mine. So grief can only arise in the mind of someone who still has self-identity, self-concept, self-grasping. That's the connection there. That's the last question. So I think we can go ahead and conclude the monk chat at this time with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.